Hello and welcome to Unit 1, Section 4, Episode 1 of Fisher's Class Notes. We're going to start our unit on government, our new government, and we're going to look today at our first Constitution. Our vocabulary: delegate, precedent, Congress, tyranny, John Locke, Articles of Confederation, federal government, states' rights, the state of Franklin, Shays' Rebellion, and secede or secession. By the end of this episode, I want you to understand four things. Number one, Americans did not want to give one person or one small group too much power. They were afraid of tyranny. Two, Americans wanted all their rights in writing. They didn't want them based on precedent, which means not in writing, just based on what's been done in the past. Three, everyone was focused on keeping power local. They didn't want to have a king far away, whether it was in Great Britain or whether they were in Georgia and somebody else was in Boston. They wanted to keep the power local so that there would be 13 powerful states that were united. And finally, we'll see that some people worry that the federal government was made too weak under the Articles of Confederation, which it was, and they wanted a stronger national government. These people are known as Federalists, and we'll talk more about them next episode. So we're going to start with a great quote by Thomas Jefferson, our third president, and also the writer of the Declaration of Independence. And he essentially talked about what the whole purpose of the war was so that we could create a new government. In truth, a new government is the whole object of the present controversy. For should a bad government be instituted for us in the future, it had as well to accept at first the bad one offered to us from beyond the water without the risk and expense of the contest. Meaning, why would we fight a war, lose all those people, lose all that money, if we don't create a good government? We might as well just stay British subjects. So what are their goals? They had three main goals. Americans wanted to protect their individual rights. This is big. They wanted to limit the power of the government in writing. So it was going to be very clear in writing what the government could not do and could do and what our individual rights were. They didn't want it based on precedent, meaning laws that are based on past events, not something written down. And three, they wanted strong local governments, weak federal national government. Well, what were their fears? It all goes down to tyranny. I mean, it makes sense that they would create a weak government because they didn't want to have a strong king that could take away their rights or be tyrannical. So they were really afraid of tyranny or giving any one group or one person too much power. Two, not being represented. Remember, that was a big deal, the idea that people would make decisions about them without somebody representing them being part of that decision-making process. And finally, and very importantly, they didn't want to be taxed without their consent. So all this was based on the philosophy of this guy, John Locke. He was a French philosopher about 100 years before this time, and he wrote in his second treatise, he argued essentially that the government wasn't put on earth from a higher power. Essentially, it was a contract that could be broken. The purpose of government was to protect the rights and the freedoms and the safety of the people, and if the government wasn't doing that, then the people could break their contract or walk away and find a new government. So our first constitution was called the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. Think of the name literally. It was 13 individual sovereign states, kind of like 13 countries that all kind of worked together, but basically they were all individual. And this was our form of government after the war from 1781 to 1787. It was made right before the end of the war. Okay, so the big thing was keeping power local in the states. Americans wanted to have representatives that they voted for, that represented their needs, that would make decisions. So states were very, very powerful, way more powerful than the actual government. Only things they could not do was they could not make a treaty with another country. So Georgia could not treaty with Spain, Florida, right under them, without the Articles of Confederation. So without the federal government helping that decision. Two, they couldn't break off altogether, like what the South does later with the Civil War. That no group of states could break off and form their own union or confederation. And three, no state could keep a standing army. Remember, they were really scared of having that standing army like that the British had put all those soldiers mostly in Boston, but then throughout the colonies. They wanted to make sure that there was no standing army. So basically, they were all really united. Think of the name literally, 13 united states, separate states. Positives, well, of course, the government accurately represented the people. But the negatives is that each state had its own needs, its own desires, so they're thinking just for themselves, and they have a really hard time coming together. You get a lot of regionalism, different regions fighting each other, and that's going to really come into play when we talk about the Civil War. So basically, the individual states didn't want to be controlled. Nobody wanted to be controlled. It was a logical first step after the American Revolution. So why would we create a government without any power? Again, we were afraid of tyranny. We were trying to avoid the ability for anyone to take away our rights or to be tyrannical. So we basically created a government without power. I love this cartoon. It kind of shows U.S. federal government, Uncle Sam, sitting there without being able to do anything as two different states argued with each other. Congress was created only to negotiate with other countries and try to resolve states' issues, but they couldn't. Each state had one representative or one vote, so everybody got an equal vote. They could not tax unless all 13 states, so that's never going to happen, but all 13 states had to agree. They had no executive branch or president, and the government could declare war. The problem is the government can't tax people, and so you can't fight a war if you don't have taxes. So I can say I declare war on you, but if I can't raise taxes to pay my soldiers and to buy supplies, then it doesn't matter. Also, they needed a super majority, which means 2/3, to change any law or to make a new law. And that's never going to happen. We'll see some examples about that. So basically, after the American Revolution, everybody was super poor because wars are super expensive. Remember, after the French and Indian War, Britain was in major debt. Well, the Americans were in major debt, and they had no way to raise taxes. So, first case is right in North Carolina. It's called the State of Franklin, 1784, only a few years after the American Revolution. North Carolina had all this western land that was sort of Indian territory, but you did get a fair amount of people living in this area, which is called Franklin. It's in the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina. No longer North Carolina, but at the time it was no part of North Carolina. And basically North Carolina offered all this western land to the federal government so that they could make some money. Basically, the federal government would sell this land and make some money and pay off some of the war debts, pay off some of the soldiers they owed money to. And since Franklin was thinking, well, North Carolina, you don't really pay much attention to us, we want to be our own independent state. They were mad because the delegates focused in eastern North Carolina and didn't really care about what was going on in western North Carolina. So this area of Franklin decided to secede from North Carolina, which means to break away or declare independence. And they wanted to be the 14th state. Okay. So this is Franklin, this is modern day Tennessee, but at the time this was all part of North Carolina. Franklin applied to Congress to be the 14th state. 7 of the 13 delegates did support the state of Franklin, but that's not enough. They needed a supermajority or 9. The Articles of Confederation didn't even give the federal government any power to help them or stop them. North Carolina asked the federal government, please help us get our land back, and the federal government couldn't do anything. And so essentially, North Carolina had to create their own militia, and they went and reconquered Franklin. Eventually, Franklin would become part of Tennessee and become the 16th state in 1796. There were some famous individuals born there, including Davy Crockett. Our next example is Case 2, Shays' Rebellion, which was in Massachusetts, 1786. Revolutionary War left the whole government poor, but of course a lot of people poor. And a lot of the farmers who had fought in the American Revolution couldn't pay their taxes. Remember what happened with Tryon before the Revolution? When people couldn't pay their taxes, their farms got confiscated. So Daniel Shays, he was one of these farmers who was a Revolutionary War hero. In fact, he fought at the Battle of Bunker Hill, one of the first famous battles of the Revolutionary War. And he led this rebellion of farmers to fight against the tyranny of Massachusetts. The local government of Massachusetts, they believed, were being tyrannical because they were confiscating their farms. So believe it or not, Samuel Adams. Remember this guy? Samuel Adams was one of the major founders of Sons of Liberty. He was the one who fought for taxation, make sure we're represented and fight against tyranny and all that stuff. Well, he now is a wealthy congressman. He was wealthy at the time, but now he's a congressman, and he tries to stop the farmers from protesting. So the very guy who started all this revolutionary stuff, he's now trying to stop these revolutions against his new government. Daniel Shays led this rebellion of farmers, much like the regulators in North Carolina. U.S. Congress tried to raise a militia, but again, they don't have the money. There's no way that they can pay farmers. So Congress could not levy the taxes under the Articles of Confederation. Eventually, just like in North Carolina with the state of Franklin, Massachusetts had to pay for their own army. So what's the lesson? The lesson is the federal government was powerless. We needed a stronger federal government. The Articles of Confederation just were ineffective. They were no good. But don't think that they were stupid, because they really were a logical first step for a people scared of tyranny. All right, thanks for watching.